Hello, Eiffel Tower listeners. Today you're going to be hearing from Boris Petrovic, a Serbian tour guide and author in Paris who's just penned a volume of books called Fiat Lux, based on Notre Dame. This is a deep dive into Notre Dame, and I'll let Boris explain it to you. But first, a huge thank you to the Patreon supporters of this show and the Substack supporters. There's no sponsor right now, so without you guys, I don't even know what I would be doing. I certainly wouldn't be sitting here doing a podcast. I'd probably be, I don't even dare to think about it. I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I hope you enjoy all the extras that come with supporting this show, including the PDF guide to Paris that you get upon sign up. The other thing I'll announce before we get going is tour season is underway. I will be doing a lot of tours this summer personally. Mondays in the Marais is my specialty, but I'm doing a lot of Latin Quarter too. Check it out. I'll link to it below, theeiffeltower.com/tours. We do more than that too. Speaking of tours, Boris does a good one of Notre Dame. Let's hear what he has to say about his book, The Cathedral, and the symbolism behind it all. Here we go. Boris Petrovic.
There you go. You nailed it.
Serbian, can we say intellectual?
You can. I don't mind.
Are you French as well?
I am, yeah.
So you're a Serbian, French, can we say genius?
No, I wouldn't go that far.
You're a deep thinker, though.
Yeah, I am, yeah.
And
I leave the genius part to the others,
We'll leave it to the audience.
Yeah.
But I figured that you finally finished a book that I know has taken you a long time.
Yes.
And it's a very, very deep dive into Notre Dame. And what I hoped is that over this next half an hour, we can talk progressively deeper.
Mm-hmm.
So start off on a level that everyone will, even a child will follow along. And then gradually, I think I'll lose my footing. And you'll be talking to the very smart people out there in listener land. Is that all right? Is that a good way to do it?
That's perfect, man. Let's do it like that.
Because I don't know if anyone's ever written such a deep dive into this cathedral.
Well, I don't know either. It kind of depends on which aspect of the cathedral you want to focus on. But if you want to start from the basics, it's one of the world's most famous monuments that was made even more famous by the unfortunate fire in April 2019. Which is something that is quite curious. The day when the fire started is the day when I finished writing my manuscript.
Really?
So it was really the day, yeah. I remember it for two reasons. I was like, finally, this is done. And then a couple of hours later, we start getting news about the fire.
Well, can we go? Were you in Paris at the time?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to that moment, which I think everybody can relate to. Everyone remembers where they were when Notre Dame was burning. Where were you standing?
I was in my apartment and I was getting news. The funny thing, also tragic, I gave a tour of Notre Dame that same day, just a couple of hours before the fire started.
Right.
So, yeah, I remember the whole thing, as you say.
And then did you make it down there while it was on fire? How were you emotionally feeling about it?
I think it's that moment where we all understood just how important it was, because to me, before that, it was obviously important enough for me to want to write this very long research. But on the same token, I was just looking at it as a monument. But then it dawned on me that it has this deep meaning and that we're all connected to it. And we were all kind of frozen in horror, really, when we watched the rooftop go up and everything. I wasn't there. I didn't go to see the fire, because I didn't want to, contribute to the crowd. I thought the firemen need all the space they need so they can, come and do their thing. So I stayed home and followed the news. I was glued to the screen, all the screens I had at the moment. So yeah,
I think I had a similar thing. I was playing basketball, and I missed all the sort of action. And then by the time I finished, I was out in the suburbs and I had 7,000 text messages, and I went down there. I didn't even think about blocking off the.
Yeah.
You're a better person than I am, but I think it was long turned into embers at this point. But I had this similar revelation that you did, because for me it's always been this beautiful architectural thing, and then I heard people singing hymns and praying and crying. I was like, wow, it has such a different meaning for so many different people, and it was also that day that I sort of I saw the depth to this cathedral. But the other huge day in the cathedral's life has been fairly recently when it reopened to the public triumphantly.
Yes.
Phoenix rising from the ashes. Tours. Now you're a tour guide as well. Tourists are allowed in, tour guides not.
Yeah.
Did you follow those rules?
I did as best as I could, though. Yeah, there was an issue with the security of Notre Dame. I was sort of blacklisted for a while because they would not believe that I was going inside with the clients and keeping my mouth shut. They don't mind anyone going inside as long as you don't tour. And this is something that's connected to the previous point you were making, the deep spiritual meaning and significance and function really of Notre Dame, is that it is a four-role, a church and a cathedral. And so what the authorities of Notre Dame want up until the 9th of June, they want to make sure that it serves its cult and that it's there as a church primarily, not as a tourist site. And so they don't allow any guided tours inside. And of course, since I visited Notre Dame like 10 times a day in that reopening period, they got suspicious of all the tour guides. They started accusing us of guiding inside, though we weren't. And that was like a whole thing, yeah.
How did that, I mean, if you don't mind me asking, how did that go when the security approached the guides?
Well, it was a gradual thing. They're like, "Oh, you're spending awful lot of time here," and I'm like, "Yeah, I'm visiting the cathedral." And they're like, "Well, are you a guide?" And I'm like, "Yes, I am." And they're like, "Well, there's no guiding inside." And I'm like, "Yeah, I know. I'm not guiding inside. I'm guiding outside, and I'm going in." And they're like, "Oh, that's not what you're doing." And then it's like the whole thing kind of escalated. And then they acquainted me with the fact that they have 200 cameras inside and that they have staff that's specifically there to prevent people from tour guiding, and that they're out there just looking to see who's talking. You're not supposed to talk, so it's like this whole thing, And
Nice.
yeah, I had several meetings with their security staff, with the chief of security. So it was like me trying to explain them that I'm following the rules, them being very suspicious. But then it got off to this real weird point where we started talking so much it kind of almost got friendly. It's like, "Oh, it's you again," and I'm like, "Yeah, it's me. What are you up to today?" So,
Yeah.
but this kind of a frenemy situation.
Did they end
but,
up buying your books, these security guards?
I think I'm gonna give it to them as a gift,
Yeah.
actually. Yeah. So that's as soon as I get the French edition, I'm gonna, take it to them. But yeah.
Shall we take a dive into these books? The name of the books, book/books. It's a very thick hardback book, but it's also 7 much thinner hardback books.
Yeah.
Fiat Lux is the name, which is Latin.
Exactly. It's one of the beginning verses of the Bible. It's "Let there be light." And,
Genesis.
yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
See, and it's this whole idea of creation of the world that light is the first thing to be created, and the whole thing is about light. The Gothic art is entirely invested in light. So this is why it's this whole thing of the beginning. And you were talking about Phoenix rising from the ashes, the cathedral that's reopened again. So really the symbolism of light is incredibly profound. And this is something I was inspired by and I was guided by when I was writing the book itself. So yeah, it's very adequate, I think.
I think Guided by the Light is a Bruce Springsteen song.
Really?
Let's
Yeah.
bring it into today as well. So is that a gamble to name your book after a Latin biblical phrase, knowing that it's not, like if you're from a business perspective, the best title for a book about Notre Dame would be Notre Dame something, right?
Probably. I wasn't thinking about it in, those business terms necessarily. I just thought it was so perfect. Let there be light. If you think about the experience you have once you're inside Notre Dame, and you think about the experience of stained glass and how it's conducive to light, and it becomes light of many colors, and it becomes light that you can physically observe, which is not something you can usually do. You see things thanks to light, but you don't see the light itself. Well, these windows, they make you see the light itself. And then it all goes back to this other biblical verse, the word assumed flesh from Gospel of John, which, makes a connection between the two, because you get to see light and you get to see that Christ became a material form of a God. So it's all connected. This is the experience the church wants to give you. So I was like, yeah, even though the name is not perhaps the best, I'm sticking to it. And that's,
And this whole, I know that you're a huge fan of Gothic.
I am, yes.
How did that come about?
It's when I was much younger, this is over 20 years ago, I wrote this very large study on William Blake. And William Blake has this whole thing that he was a poet and not really a painter, but, like a graphic artist, let's say. And he's dedicated a lot of his time visually analyzing Romanesque and Gothic art. And so for the purposes of that research, I studied Gothic, and that got me hooked. And I was like, this is really amazing. And I got to travel around that. So I got to visit some Gothic cathedrals for the first time in my life, St. Vitus in Prague, for example. And it really blew me away. I mean, visually, if you don't know anything about Gothic art, you just see the interior of a Gothic church or of a cathedral, and it's a mind-blowing experience. But then if you get to read about it and you get to learn about symbolism and what light represents and how stained glass is made, it's supremely interesting. And this is really something that got me hooked. So when I came to Paris and I discovered that this is where Gothic style originated from, literally on the outskirts of Paris from Saint-Denis, then it got me further into this research. And then, of course, when I started working as a guide, it was, a lot of visiting of Notre Dame and many other Gothic sites, and I just got deeper and deeper and down the rabbit hole.
Can we do a gentle, I know I've talked about it on the show before, but a gentle rewind for people at home thinking Gothic, you lost me, Boris. What's Gothic?
Yeah, well, the appellation is a bit of problematic because we have this subculture of Goth people who are very dark and brooding and, into that kind of affairs, but it has nothing to do with Gothic architecture. It has everything to do with Gothic literature that was a very popular genre in the 18th and the 19th century. And things like, let's say, Wuthering Heights, a very famous Gothic novel, or Frankenstein, that's by Mary Shelley.
Why are these called Gothic novels?
Well, it's this idea that we started seeing Gothic art, in the 18th and the 19th century as something incredibly ugly and unbecoming and blown out of proportion. So if you think about, let's say, Victor Hugo and his Hunchback of Notre Dame, or just Notre Dame, he saw it as he wrote an entire book with Quasimodo, the title character, being a human stand-in for Notre Dame. So to him, this was something hideous, monstrous even, and he appreciated it for all of those things, because that period is all about appreciating grotesque, ugly, exotic, strange. People saw it that way, but initial plan of Gothic art, of Gothic architecture has nothing to do with it. It's all about light, and it's all about uplifting your spirit, aiming yourself towards heaven. And so there's this big discrepancy. When we say Gothic, we tend to think about Gothic novels, Gothic literature, which is all about mystery and the occult, and and it's completely different. It's just that our aesthetics have changed quite drastically. In the 19th century, we just thought everything Gothic was, extremely ugly. And it's funny from today's perspective that we think that that's not really the case. We kind of came back to this medieval position that that's the most beautiful thing we can imagine.
And in terms of churches and buildings around Paris, I remember talking to you about this years ago about Art Nouveau and trying to simplify it down so that I could understand it.
Yeah. Art Nouveau comes out of Gothic. Yeah, you're right. So
well, there you go. But like Gothic, a hack would be anything tall and thin with stained glass windows that makes you look up and go, "Oh my God!" Literally.
Yeah,
pretty much.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's get deeper here. So the book is the books. Which do you prefer, book or books?
I don't know. I spent
Baby
so much
or babies?
Yeah, they're all my babies. I think a book, because I spent a lot of time writing it as one thing, and it's just recently that I decided to break it down into 7 books where each is a chapter. So
it's kind of biblical as well. This.
Yeah, it's books and a book. Yeah,
and they're very colorful as well. You've got you had an artist come in and do
that's true. Yeah,
some kind of mind bending
illustrations.
Do you want to describe those illustrations for us?
Well, it's like a happy incident, really, that I had these really precise instructions for him. And I told him, you need to do these things. And then he didn't really listen all that well, which turned out to be good because he infused it with a lot of his own vision. So I think it was a really happy, creative collaboration between my instructions and what I thought was best for the book and what he kind of, felt himself. So, yeah. It's not quite as Catholic, as I wanted it to be in terms of illustrations, because he is very proficient in painting Orthodox icons. So he is an icon painter. So it's kind of in between, which it makes it all the more interesting for me.
But in terms of the actual pictures themselves, these are colorful. I mean, to describe them, they remind me of something between a dream and a nightmare.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean? There's hints of abstract, lots of color. I mean, these are not watercolor pictures of Notre Dame at sunset, for example.
I think I really like what you just said because, it has this thing it has a connection with a sense of awe, something that is awe-inspiring. And there's always a bit of fear in that. And there's always a bit of terror. You think of yourself in the presence of God, you're going to be afraid as you can be because that's something that it's truly, terrifying. But it's also amazing at the same time. So if you felt that it was between a dream and a nightmare, I think that's really exactly where it needs to be. So,
Perfect.
yeah.
What about in researching this book? Was there something you found that surprised even yourself after all these visits?
Yeah. Well, research took 2.5 years, and writing itself way less. But the further you go in, things just open up. So, for example, you think about Freemasons and how they built the entire thing, and how Masons were a guild back in the day that was busy with building stuff. But then you start discovering this whole mythology around it, and you start discovering how they built their entire story and the backstory, and how they saw themselves as these deeply wise men who worked on the stone as much as the stone worked on them. So there's this really deep connection between yourself and your profession, and how it defines you and how it changes you as a person. So the deeper you go into that, the more interesting it gets. You think about the generations that took to build Notre Dame. It took 187 years to be completed. So you had entire families build their entire lives, their entire existences into making this one incredibly important thing. So if you think about it on a personal level, that was a bit of a discovery for me to go and follow that line of reasoning, that it's not just a majestic cathedral, it's not just a beautiful work of art and architecture, but that many people, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of people, spend their entire lives, and they've given everything they've got to make this happen. So you think about the personal angle, and it becomes a completely different thing.
I wonder with the have you read Pillars of the Earth, by the way?
I haven't, no, but I'm constantly reminded that I should. So.
Yeah, okay, there's another one.
Yeah, there you go.
But if this cathedral took 187 years to make at the start,
Yeah.
and then another 5 years plus to remake at the end, that leaves us with a gap in the middle of, 600 years or something?
Give or take, yeah.
Were intriguing things happening then that you researched into your book, or did it just sort of exist?
Oh, no, of course, yeah. Many intriguing things. It's.
I mean, obviously things
Yeah.
happen, but I mean, those have to be the biggest sort of bookends, the building and the rebuilding of it, or did you find that there were...
There was a much more important intervention that took place in the 40s, from the 40s to the 60s of the 19th century. So this was the initial great renovation that was done by Eugène Viollet-le-Duc.
My hero.
Your hero,
Yeah.
who is kind of a villain in most stories, because not, to burst your bubble, but...
It sounds like something between a dream and a nightmare, Boris.
Almost, yeah, there you go. So, because the reconstruction that he's done was very destructive, because he's altered so many aspects of the cathedral that were seen as fundamental. He's installed a much larger spire. He's added a lot of ornamentations. He's displaced some of the stained glass windows. He's erased some statues and added new ones. So you could say that a lot of the fine and intricate symbolism that had to do with alchemy, that had to do with astrology, was lost. And you could have read Notre Dame really as an alchemical cookbook in a way. And some of those were lost thanks to what he's done.
But do you suspect, or do you know if these kind of things... Like, do you think he was into all this symbolism, and when he came in to essentially renovate it, was he like out with the alchemy and in with my kind of thing, or did that just happen to be a byproduct of his extension?
I think it was a byproduct. I don't think he was very interested in alchemy, because, I also have this very thick encyclopedia of medieval architecture that was written by Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, and you can see him really being invested in architecture and not really caring that much about all the esoteric aspects of the cathedral. He's really an architect. He really thinks about, things that architects think about, how the forces come together and how it all makes sense, and how do you create a chapel properly. So this is his line of reasoning. He wasn't really open for all the, I would say, profound things. But it also has to do with that particular period. We have to understand that while he was renovating Notre Dame, there were serious voices that demanded it for be demolished. And this is entirely unimaginable today, because we were also grief-stricken by the fire, and we were also worried about Notre Dame, and then the renovation cost, a lot of money. But they were seriously considering in the beginning of the 19th century demolishing the thing. There's just like, it's old, it's dilapidated, it's falling apart, let's build something else instead. And they've destroyed so much of Paris. We talked about it when we talked about Haussmannian Paris, that so many other important monuments were gone, because that was the period where people were fascinated by the Industrial Revolution, and they were like, out with the old, in with the new. Don't think about it. So yeah, there was a bit of that spirit with him as well, though he was strangely enough, there to preserve and to renovate and to uplift all things medieval. So, yeah.
I think, I mean, I like him because he's got his fingerprints inexplicably everywhere in France. I discovered him when I went to Carcassonne, the medieval town, or not
I've
just
been there,
medieval, every town that they've built into one. And then I just found his name pops up everywhere around France and all the hits really. But at the time that he was around, was that the same time that Haussmann and Victor Hugo were around?
Yeah.
They were all kicking around at the same time?
Yeah, pretty much.
So then that was a huge period for Notre Dame. And are people exaggerating when they talk about Victor Hugo saving it?
No, not really. He was really the one. He wrote Notre Dame of Paris, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, as it was translated to English in 1831. It was published. And if you read the introduction to that novel, it's basically an essay of him pleading to leave Notre Dame alone and not to demolish it, and him complaining about all these other beautiful churches that were destroyed, so as to make way for what would eventually be the Haussmannian intervention. And no, this is not an exaggeration for us to say that he had an instrumental role in making sure that Notre Dame still stays there. It's funny because he did it for all the wrong reasons, because he was like, oh my God, this is so incredibly ugly, we have to keep it. Like, it's just this hideous thing we need to admire. It's like, no, it's not. It's amazing.
How interesting.
Yeah. So he saved it for all the wrong reasons, but it doesn't matter. He saved it. That's the most important thing.
And does all that stuff feature in your book as well?
Yeah, some of it, yeah. I talk about Victor Hugo, and it's, by the end of it, when I talk about the relationship between Industrial Revolution and Notre Dame, and how the industrial period was very invested in the medieval period, and how there's a deep connection between skyscrapers and Gothic cathedrals, how they're essentially made to be one and the same thing. So yeah, I discussed that as well.
What about some deep symbolism in there that we're looking at in the Notre Dame and we're not even realizing?
Well, there's the symbolism of the rose. That's a very important thing when we talk about the rose windows. And then there's the whole symbolism of gold.
Let's get into both of them. Tell me about the rose.
The rose
rose window, the two big, I guess, north and south facing
north and south,
stained glass windows.
Old in the New Testament,
Why? I didn't even know why they're called the rose windows.
Well, people call them different things. It's rosace in French, or Saint Catherine's wheel window. That's another way of saying it. But it really has to do with this medieval idea of what a rose is. And it's basically the flower that depicts the structure of heaven. The rose opens up its petals. It has a narrow center, and then its petals are opening up, and there are broader and broader circles in a way, so concentric circles, which is how a lot of people imagine heaven. Now, of course, you have the other layer of symbolism of the rose, that it stands for purity and virginity, and it's this very exclusive flower that is used in fragrances, that is used in food as well. People eat roses, use it as perfumes and spices, and it really has to do with something that is elevated, a connection between heaven and earth in a way, because it's a flower, and flowers are symbols of fertility in many pagan cultures. But at the same time, it's a type of flower that points towards heaven and points towards something more beautiful. So if you think about the smell of a flower, that's something you don't necessarily see, but you feel. And you feel it in a very poignant, very sometimes dramatic manner. So it also has to do with this idea of a smell and something you cannot touch, or something you cannot really hold, but it's there, kind of like divine presence. You feel it all around, but you don't see it. You don't get to experience it firsthand. So it has to do with that, and it has to do with orientating our gaze upwards. Now, you saw it, you were in Notre Dame yourself. If you want to watch the rose window, if you want to observe it, you have to look up. And it's this whole idea that it uplifts not only your gaze, but also your spirit.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Not to mention the thorn of the rose. Where does that come in? Does that come in anywhere?
Well, that's a very good question, because a lot of it has to do with pain. If you think about Catholicism as it is, especially Marian Catholicism, it's very invested in the sensual, and it's very invested in this idea of a quality of divine love, how God loves us. God loves us, that's a basic premise, but when God loves us, he gives us a lot of pain. He gives us a lot of suffering. This is not just to test our resilience and our faith, but because through suffering we thrive and we get closer to God. So, getting closer to the rose, meaning being pricked on its thorns. So it's all connected in that manner as well.
I knew we'd get deep. There's a William Blake poem,
Oh, of course.
that mentions the modest rose puts forth a thorn. Do you know that one?
Yeah, I know that one, yeah.
Okay, let's get into gold. Let's finish on gold. I love a bit of symbolism. When I think gold and Notre Dame, I can't make any connections.
Yeah, there's a lot of like gilded things inside, especially in the sacristy. The gold itself is really light, and this is the thing. Gold, in its material form, is seen in alchemical terms as sunlight condensed. And sunlight is really gold in its ethereal form. So this is something that is tremendously interesting. You'll have to interrupt me because I'm going to nerd out. But
I
you brought it up. The thing is that we see one as a stand-in for the other. We see sunlight as representative of gold and vice versa. Now, the interesting thing about it is the origin of gold. If you think about how gold comes to be, we dig it from the ground, but that's not where it's created. Gold cannot be created in the earth. It basically is created in an explosion of a star, in a supernova. So that is the only time when enough energy is released for gold to be created as matter. And you see, what is really interesting here is that people who were invested in alchemy 800 or so years ago knew that there was this connection between sun and gold, because this is how gold is created, by an explosion of a sun. This is how everything else is created too. If you think about planets coming to be, what happens is that stars explode, then clouds of space dust form called nebulas, and then after a while they start gathering together, driven by increasing gravity, and so they gather together and planets and sometimes even other new stars are formed. So everything happens from one source. And then you can see how this is religiously inspired too, how you can say that there's one big explosion when the universe came to be, which was, by the way, the Big Bang Theory, something that was created by a Belgian monk. So a priest basically came up with this theory that explains the universe. But it also has to do with the origin of the gold. And then it also has to do with this idea that the interior of the cathedral is the place where you discover deep truths, not only about yourself, but about the universe as such. And the nature of gold, the nature of sunlight, is something that stands in for Jesus Christ. So we see him symbolically represented by sunlight. In this case, that is Virgin Mary. So you think about the cathedral, you think about Virgin Mary's presence as she is pregnant with Jesus Christ. So she is the stone shell that holds this divine light inside of her. So it's really that symbolism of gold and symbolism of light is all important, which is another reason why I opted for Fiat Lux. I was like, this is going to be...
That ties it nicely back to the name of your book. Fiat Lux is the name of the book. I said that we'd get deeper, and I had no idea we'd get into the creation of planets and the explosions of stars. But that's what I kind of always expect when I meet with you, Boris Petrovic. That's your name. The book is Fiat Lux. Get in contact with Boris if you want to do a tour of Notre Dame, or if you want to find his books. You can find them on his website. It's a good place to start. Otherwise, Amazon. They'll all be linked down below. But Boris, thanks for coming in again, and thanks for enlightening us on Notre Dame.
Thanks for having me, Oliver. This flew by in a minute. Yeah.
It always does. Until next time, Boris, merci beaucoup. And again, that was Boris Petrovic, his book/books, Fiat Lux, Fiatlux. It's all going to be linked in the show notes below. Just scroll down wherever you're listening and you'll see all the show notes. Once again, thanks to the Patreon and Substack supporters for supporting this work. I appreciate it no end. My name's Oliver G. This is the Eiffel Tower. See you next week.